My first impressions of Helena have been generally confirmed, wrote Elizabeth Chester Fisk in 1867. She continued the letter to her sister living in Connecticut. I like the place much. It is not like home, but there is a wide field for usefulness here, and entering upon the work earnestly and prayerfully, we need never be lonely or disheartened. There is room for everyone to win a name and influence that shall be widespread and shall ever be for good on those around. Elizabeth Fisk and her husband Robert, editor of the Helena Herald, traveled by steamboat up the Missouri River to Fort Benton. When they arrived in Helena, they didn't find a pastoral, rural village. Instead, they found Last Chance Gulch, a cosmopolitan city of about 3,000. The frontier the Fisks and 1,000 others created was urban. Settlers came to live in cities, in towns, to become part of communities. Unlike the trapper and the trader, they lived in families and neighborhoods. Unlike the farmers back east in the Midwest, the settlers were merchants, business entrepreneurs. Few wanted to farm. The reason? Gold. The fever spread slowly for a time. In 1858, the first traces definitely recorded were found at Gold Creek, east of Drummond. But neither the town, American Fork, nor the diggings ever amounted to much. Then, in 1862, John White discovered placer gold on Grasshopper Creek. The rush to Montana was on, and our first boom town, Bannock City, sprang up at the Grasshopper diggings. The time was right for gold in Montana. The easy diggings in California, Nevada, and Colorado had played out. Prospectors searching for gold in Idaho filtered into southwestern Montana, looking for a pass through the Bitterroots. What they found was even better. Alder Gulch, one of the richest placer gold deposits in the United States. On June 2nd, 1863, a discouraged prospecting party camped at the Madison-Jefferson Divide. They panned for a little tobacco money. $2.40 later, they knew they'd hit pay dirt. Within 4 days, hundreds of gold-hungry men stampeded from Bannock to the new diggings, Alder Gulch. And within a year and a half, dozens of cities dotted the rugged terrain. 10,000 people crowded into the narrow gulch. Many simply called the area 14 Mile City. In 3 short years, Alder Gulch gave up $30 million in gold. Confederate Gulch was another place where prospectors discovered one of the richest gold fields per acre. The Montana Publishing Company's Statistical Almanac for 1869 had this to say about Confederate Gulch. Late in the spring of last year, bedrock was reached, and the enormous yield of $180 to the pan in Montana Gulch was forgotten in the excitement of the wonderful yield of over $1,000 to a pan of gravel. An average day's sluicing in Confederate Gulch brought $3,000 to $8,000. Some of the prospectors who came were fortune hunters. Occasionally, they stumbled upon gold. Others, however, systematically located the mineral deposits and, in an organized way, removed the ore. They worked in teams and in small companies. They found mineral lodes by recognizing areas likely to have them. They learned to understand mineralized terrain, its plants and animals, its rock formations, and the rocks themselves.
The placer mining process is very simple. The gold is more or less milled by nature, and it comes down through creeks and streams and settles to the bottom. Gold is heavy and usually settles. The first thing that usually happens in placer mining, prospectors will find gold just by panning the gold, and it all takes very simple equipment, just a shovel, pick and shovel, and a gold pan. Very low capital investment. A little later, the miners, after they discovered some kind of a gold deposit would bring in a rocker, which is a simple little piece of machinery that they would build themselves. This, if the gold was good enough, would come into a situation where they would use sluicing. Sluice boxes would contain a long trough with a riffle, they call it, in the bottom, a bunch of little slats. The dirt would be thrown into the sluice box, and then the gold would settle as the water washed the lighter particles of dirt and rock on through, and the gold would settle between the riffles, and then they would clean it out at the end of the day. The sluicing took much more capital investment, and usually claims were consolidated, more capital needed for consolidation for building dams and ditches to run the water through. The next step in gold mining would be hydraulicking. They would take fire hoses, similar nozzles and such, wash down the cliffs and run these through sluice boxes. Much more investment needed, usually a lot more claims consolidated into one area. The final thing that happened in Alder Gulch, final stage in the process of placer mining, would be dredging. And dredging consists of a huge boat that digs its own little lake as it goes along. It digs the dirt and the gravel and everything out in front of it, runs it into the dredge, which has essentially a sluice box inside of it. Then the machinery sorts this gold through. The gold settles to the bottom, water washes the lighter stuff away, and the rock and gravel is spewed out the back, leaving the characteristic dredge piles that you see along Alder Gulch and other places where it's been dredged.
The miners who came seeking their fortunes were usually very young. The entrepreneurs who followed were generally middle-aged, experienced veterans of other mining camps. 35 years old, on the average, these 19th century businessmen brought their families. Daniel S. Tuttle, an Episcopal missionary bishop to Helena in 1868, wrote, "In my pastorship of 7 months, I married 4 couples and baptized 11 children. But funerals were very infrequent. In this time, I had only 2. The pioneers in the main were in vigorous young manhood." At the same time, however, the urban frontier tore families apart. In 1867 alone, divorces exceeded marriages in Lewis and Clark County. Domestic violence, alcoholism, divorce, disease, all worked against family stability. Elizabeth Fisk noted this in a letter to her mother in 1868. "Divorces are fashionable here, and it is a well-known fact that a man in the mountains cannot keep his wife."
The frontier placed enormous strains on marriage and family life. When the time came to part, the partners went to court, and the records of their dissolutions came here. In many cases, it was extraordinarily easy to obtain a divorce on the frontier. Probably the easiest way was desertion. It was incredibly easy for a wife or a husband to get on the train, to get on the stage and leave and disappear into the West's roving transient population. On other occasions, the violence and physical nature of the frontier spilled over into marriage, and wives especially approached the court for relief in situations which involved extreme cruelty. Minnie Cody, for example, came to court and charged her husband with extreme cruelty. Mr. Cody was accustomed to whacking his wife over the head with a frying pan at the end of their domestic quarrels. Emil Liljedahl was fond of shooting the clock off the mantelpiece when he was displeased with his dinner. Temptation was a problem also. For men, there were, of course, the fancy ladies, and for women, there was always the opportunity to better their condition in life, to use a 19th century phrase, by choosing a better partner. That was certainly the case with Alonzo and Marcia Ann Van Valkenburg. Marcia Ann and Alonzo's story is a long one, but it ended here in Montana, just a little bit south of Helena, when Alonzo and Marcia Ann were making their trip to Helena in order to set up housekeeping. Marcia Ann had brought along a former foreman from the farm, a man by the name of Thomas Downing. Thomas was also Marcia Ann's lover, and at one point it fell to Alonzo to pasture the stock. While Alonzo was away, Marcia Ann and Thomas entered the wagon, and by the jarring or motion of the wagon bed, witnessed by one Peterson, who occupied a place under the wagon, that they did at that time have criminal connection with each other. Well, that was that. I suppose the 20th century likes to believe that they invented the sexual revolution. For Marcia Ann and Alonzo, it started a century earlier.
If life in Montana's urban frontier was precarious for a wife and a mother, it was a gold mine for other, more enterprising women. Between 1865 and 1886, prostitution in Montana was the single largest source of employment for women working outside the home. Selling yourself and your services was a profitable business. The prostitutes of Helena, for example, operated alongside the town's leaders in other kinds of commerce. And though the greatest of them aren't as familiar as Samuel T. Hauser or W.A. Chessman, the empires they built were just as important to Helena's economy.
When the fancy ladies first came here, they mostly operated in single dwellings and by themselves. They were essentially proprietors, and as such, they operated as entrepreneurs. As Helena grew, the sexual marketplace grew with Helena, and these single operators were consolidated into large sporting house establishment run by the three great madams of Helena. As Helena grew, so did in fact the red light district. By 1890, the red light district paid taxes in equal amounts with Helena's leading male entrepreneurs and with the railroad. By 1890 also, like many entrepreneurs in Helena, they had overextended themselves. Their portfolios were alienated. They had a good deal of trouble staying in business. And one by one, principally Chicago Joe, her property ultimately went to a liquor wholesaler and to the Thomas Cruz Savings Bank. Lily McGraw was able to fare much better, and her property did not fall into other hands until 1900. Belle Crafton, Molly Burns, was also able to sustain her business operation until at least 1900 when she died of acute alcoholism.
Chicago Joe, the prostitute. Elizabeth Chester Fisk, the wife of the newspaper editor. Two different women, two different careers, yet both displayed independence in a society that did not approve independence in women. They could easily coexist. In fact, they could live within a few blocks of each other because it was a wide open time in Montana. People came from all over the United States and from all over the world as well. Many came from the mining camps of Colorado, and the West Siders, they came from Idaho. Many came from the Midwest. Traveling the Minnesota to Montana road, they arrived in long wagon trains. Still others came from border states, especially Missouri. So many, in fact, that the Gallatin Valley became known as Little Missouri. Yet the rush to Montana wasn't quite the same free-for-all earlier stampedes had been. For one thing, Montana was remote. In the days of covered wagons and riverboats, we were plain hard to get to. The winters were discouraging. In addition, there was a war on. The Civil War kept many young men back where the battles were being fought. Some, however, fled the war. But as distant as we were, the war still made its way to Montana. Sectional rivalry continued. A leading dry goods merchant of Virginia City, Isidore Strasburger, wrote of the reaction to Abraham Lincoln's assassination. The excitement was great. Missourians, I mean Copperhead Missourians, predominated, and they were going to celebrate. But the few Union men were determined that no celebrations should take place, and it didn't. Isidore Strasburger was one of the many young Jews who came to the Gulch during the gold rush. Although some Jews were miners, many established themselves in retail trades. Montana seemed to treat its Jews well. They participated greatly in the territory's political life. One of the first mayors of Helena and the first mayor of Butte were both Jews. While the Jews were fairly well accepted in the territory, another minority group was not. The Chinese came in such numbers, they eventually made up a third of the population in Alder Gulch. They worked the played-out diggings other miners had abandoned. A great deal of ground, which was deemed worthless, is still being profitably worked by Chinese, noted the 1869 Statistical Almanac. The United States Commissioner of Mining Statistics believed it was foolish when the Montana legislature prohibited Chinese ownership of mining claims. After all, he observed, they worked only marginal claims. Because of the exotic appearance and strange customs of the Chinese, residents of Alder Gulch and Helena feared what they called the Mongolian hordes. They limited them to the most menial work. The Chinese sought refuge in the territorial courts, and for a time the law protected their civil rights. But the law eventually gave way to fear and prejudice. The Montana legislature passed a laundry tax aimed directly at Chinese. The owner of a steam laundry had to pay $15 4 times a year. If he employed one or more persons, he paid $25. In those days, $100 a year was a lot of money. Prejudice against Chinese extended nationwide, even into the federal government. In 1882, the United States Congress passed a law limiting Chinese immigration.
Most of the Chinese did not remain in Montana for long. One reason why they moved on was certainly because of the prejudice, which was often blatant and often highly unfortunate. But the main reason that they moved on was because the economic opportunity, such as it was, that brought them here simply disappeared. Those who came to work on the railroads were generally here only for a season or so. Those in the mining camps, it's true, did stay longer. But as the surface gold disappeared, they generally moved on, usually to California or to the northwest coast, many of them from there back to their homeland. But a sizable and interesting population of Chinese did remain. In Butte, where the largest numbers of them did remain, there was a community clear up to the time of World War I of 400 to 600 Chinese. They lived in a colorful Chinatown, complete with a joss house topped with a pagoda structure, continuing to do menial work in washy houses or at interesting restaurants. The Pekin Noodle Parlor, for instance, survived into modern times. Some families of Chinese, like the Wong family in Helena, have remained prominent into modern times. They, in the end, were like other ethnic groups that came with the mining frontier. Most of them moved on, but they did leave their mark upon Montana and are very much a part of its history.
Law and lawlessness. They were serious problems on the urban frontier. Criminals found easy prey along the road between Virginia City and Bannack as hordes of treasure seekers descended. The miners established their own courts to deal with crime. Often they would convene all the miners of the district to consider a case. At other times, they appointed a jury from among their own ranks to determine a verdict. The defendant had the right to appeal the verdict to the larger group. Miners' courts were democratic. Some said too democratic. After all, many of the miners trying the cases didn't take crime too seriously. As the number of brutal murders increased, a few citizens took drastic action. They formed a vigilance committee which caught suspected criminals, tried them in secret, and executed them in public. In a single month between January and February 1864, the Virginia City Vigilantes hanged 24 men. Among those executed was Henry Plummer, sheriff of Bannock and Virginia City, and leader of the criminal gang. One writer listed a calendar of crimes and concluded, "If the facts here stated do not justify the formation of a vigilance committee in Montana, then may God help Uncle Sam's nephews when they venture west of the river in search of new diggings." Encouraging the vigilantes was the Chief Justice of the Territorial Court, Sidney Edgerton. He would soon become Montana's first territorial governor. But not everyone supported the vigilantes. Isidore Strasburger arrived in Bannock in July of 1863. He described his cynical reaction to the executions this way: "There were considerable hanging bees in early times, but as I had witnessed such trifles in '59 and '60 in Denver, it did not amuse me any more in Virginia City, and therefore paid no attention to them, but left all the fun for Colonel Sanders." Wilbur Fisk Sanders acted as official prosecutor for the Vigilance Committee.
As the number of hangings increased, disapproval grew. The unjust hangings of Raleigh and Slade disgusted residents in the Gulch. One man was hanged for murder, although his victim was still alive. The problem with the vigilante style of justice was that it lacked due process. They often presumed that the defendant was guilty unless he could prove he was innocent. In a secret trial, without an advocate, few defendants could convince the vigilantes that they were innocent. By 1867, miners had become fed up with vigilante-style justice. They posted a notice saying that they would retaliate against any further executions, adding that it would be 5 vigilante deaths for every 1 vigilante execution.
The need for law and order was one reason citizens in the Gulch pressed for the creation of Montana Territory. But there were other, more complex reasons, too.
When the mines were opened on this side of the Bitterroot Mountains, people in Montana were still technically part of Idaho Territory. This meant that supposedly they were to be governed from Lewiston, Idaho, which of course was physically impossible. Even to this day, southwestern Montana is remote from Lewiston, Idaho. So when the miners came in significant numbers, there was a very early movement to establish a separate territory. What this meant to have a territorial government was a unique American way of bridging the gap between wilderness and statehood. Most officials were, such as the governor and judges and so forth, were appointed from Washington by the president. The local residents elected a House of Representatives, a council, and a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives in Washington. In the case of Montana's early territorial politics, it was particularly spirited in the contest between Republicans and Democrats because, of course, Montana was founded during the Civil War, and the early years of our territorial existence were carried on in the aftermath of the Civil War, which historians call Reconstruction. There was a lot of differences of opinion of what was appropriate policy during Reconstruction. And some of those same differences of opinion that existed in Washington were reflected in Montana Territory. I think there's another reason why there was a spirited contest, and that is the people like Sidney Edgerton and Wilbur Fisk Sanders had very strong normative sense of what the community should be like that they were trying to build. And I think what they were struggling to do against the group they called the Missourians, which was a pejorative term for people they didn't agree with, what they were trying to do in their struggle with the Missourians was to put their proper kind of social, cultural imprint on the new community.
More and more people prospered in the territory and made it their home. Those who didn't prosper were pushed farther and farther outside society. Their existence was marginal, and they themselves were marginal. Society didn't need them. Of those outside society, none were considered more useless or more unnecessary than the Indians. The literature of the day described them as the vanishing Americans, as though they weren't even there. With their culture destroyed and relegated to abject poverty, they faced a future without hope. It hadn't always been that way.